Let me ask you something. You wake up in the morning and the first thing you do before brushing your teeth, before saying good morning to your family, is check your phone. You scroll through TikTok, Instagram, maybe some memes on Reddit, and within 10 minutes, you've already seen a war update, a climate disaster headline, a celebrity drama, and someone's perfect morning routine that makes yours feel like a failure. And you haven't even had breakfast yet. If you were born between 1997 and 2012, this is your life every single day. This is Generation Z, and trust me, there is so much more happening inside their heads than most people realize. Today, we're going deep into the psychology of Gen Z, why they think the way they think, why they feel the way they feel, and why they are honestly unlike any generation that came before them. This is going to be interesting. First, let's understand who we're actually talking about. Generation Z includes everyone born between 1997 and 2012. In 2025, that means they're roughly between 13 and 28 years old. They're the first generation to grow up completely in the age of the internet, smartphones, and social media, not like millennials who remember a time before all of this. Gen Z was born into it. This is their normal. And that one fact changes everything about how they experience the world. Think about it. Millennials saw the internet arrive and adapt to it. Gen Z never had to adapt. They just existed inside it from day one. Psychologists actually call them digital natives, which means technology isn't a tool for them. It's a language. It's a way of breathing. They use YouTube, AI tools, TikTok, and online communities not just for entertainment, but for education, identity, relationships, and even therapy. By some estimates, 95% of Gen Z have access to a smartphone, and more than half of them spend over 4 hours online every single day. That's more than they spend in a classroom. And this generation didn't just grow up with technology. They grew up alongside some of the most destabilizing events in modern history. The 2008 financial crisis, 9/11's aftermath, school shootings becoming a routine fear, climate anxiety, rising living costs, and then, just when they were figuring out life, COVID-19 shut the whole world down. Gen Z has never known a world that felt fully safe or stable, and that shapes the psychology of a generation in very profound ways. One of the most fascinating things about Gen Z psychologically is how they think about identity, and this is where things get really interesting. Previous generations had a much simpler script. You grow up, you pick a career path, you settle into a religion, maybe a political party, build a traditional family, and that's your identity. Gen Z has completely thrown that script out the window. Research from McKinsey actually found that one of the defining psychological traits of Gen Z is that they refuse to define themselves in just one way. They don't want to be put in a box, not by gender labels, not by career titles, not by political party. They are fluid, complex, and they wear multiple identities at once. One person can be a gamer, a climate activist, a small business owner, and openly struggling with anxiety, all at the same time. And they see no contradiction in that. But here's the complicated part. Social media has made identity construction both easier and harder at the same time. On one hand, they have access to communities from all over the world that help them explore who they are. A Gen Z kid in a small town can find a community of people who share their exact niche interests online. That's genuinely powerful. On the other hand, algorithms are constantly feeding them curated content that influences what they believe, what they value, and how they see themselves, often without them even realizing it. Their identities are being algorithmically co-constructed, as researchers put it. They're building themselves, yes, but also being built by what the internet keeps showing them. And underneath all of this runs a deep craving for authenticity. Gen Z can spot fake from a mile away. They grew up watching hyper-edited Instagram perfection and influencer culture, and they learned to distrust it. They want real, raw, unfiltered. That's why platforms like Be Real gained popularity, and why TikTok's unpolished casual format resonated so much more than the glossy world of Instagram. Authenticity for Gen Z isn't just a preference, it's practically a value system.
Now let's talk about the part that actually keeps researchers, psychologists, and parents up at night, and that is the mental health reality of Gen Z. The numbers here are genuinely alarming. A 2023 Gallup survey found that nearly 47% of Gen Zers often or always feel anxious. A report from the American Psychological Association Association found that Gen Z is 27% more likely than previous generations to describe their mental health as fair or poor. And according to research from the Walton Family Foundation, 42% of Gen Zers struggle with depression and feelings of hopelessness, which is almost twice the rate of people over the age of 25. Let that sink in. Nearly half of this generation is carrying anxiety with them every single day. Why? Well, the causes are layered and complicated. Social media creates a brutal comparison culture. Researchers call it the compare and despair trap. You're constantly measuring your real life against someone else's highlight reel, and your real life will always lose that comparison. Studies show that adolescents who spend more time on social media than in face-to-face interaction consistently report higher levels of loneliness. And this is a generation that spends enormous amounts of time communicating through screens, not in person. Then there's what researchers call eco-anxiety, the psychological distress caused by climate change. A landmark Lancet study found that over 60% of young people worldwide feel extremely worried about climate change. For Gen Z, this isn't an abstract future concern. It's happening right now. They've grown up with wildfires, floods, and warnings that if their generation doesn't act, there may not be a livable planet for their children. That kind of weight on a young person's mind is genuinely heavy. Economic anxiety adds another layer. Tuition costs have skyrocketed. The housing market feels completely out of reach. Student loan debt has grown over 230% between 2006 and 2020. Many Gen Zers feel they are already falling behind before they've even started, and that creates deep-seated psychological stress. But here's something important to acknowledge. Gen Z is also the first generation to openly and unapologetically talk about mental health. They have destigmatized therapy, normalized conversations about anxiety and depression, and they're 37% more likely to have worked with a mental health professional compared to older generations. They use therapy apps, mindfulness tools, and online peer communities. They genuinely believe, and this is a quote from their culture, that taking care of your mind is just as important as taking care of your body. That shift in attitude is huge. It doesn't erase the pain, but it represents a radical step forward for mental health awareness as a whole.
Here's something genuinely paradoxical about Gen Z and technology. They know it's hurting them, and they keep using it anyway. And no, that's not weakness, that's psychology. A 2023 report by the APA found that 46% of Gen Z admit that social media makes them feel worse about their life, and yet they're on it for hours every day. Why? Because social media isn't just entertainment for them. It's where their social life exists. It's where they find community, validation, information, and belonging. Logging off doesn't just mean avoiding a few apps. It means stepping out of the primary social world they grew up in. That's not a simple choice. Psychologists explain this through the lens of variable reward systems, the same psychological mechanism behind gambling. Every time you open Instagram or TikTok, you don't know whether you'll see something exciting, get a notification, or receive a dopamine hit of validation. That unpredictability is what makes these platforms so addictive, and Gen Z grew up with this system wired into their daily life from a very young age. The always-on culture this creates is genuinely exhausting. Research shows it's associated with higher rates of attention difficulties, sleep problems, and what some psychologists are now calling digital burnout. But Gen Z is also developing coping mechanisms, intentional screen time limits, digital detoxes, muting notifications. They are learning, often the hard way, how to exist in a hyper-connected world without being consumed by it. Beyond mental health, Gen Z's psychology also shows up powerfully in what they value and how they approach work in the future. And this is where older generations often misunderstand them the most. Gen Z is frequently labeled as lazy or entitled in the workplace, but research tells a completely different story. Studies show that Gen Z actually prioritizes meaningful work over high salaries more than any generation before them. They want to know their work matters. They care about whether their employer has ethical practices. They are 70% more likely to support companies they perceive as genuinely ethical. They want work-life balance, flexible hours, and mental health support from employers. These aren't signs of laziness. They're signs of a generation that watched their parents and grandparents sacrifice everything for jobs that eventually downsized them anyway and decided, not me. Gen Z is also extraordinarily socially conscious. They organize on social media. They participate in movements. They demand accountability from corporations and governments. Climate change,
LGBTQ+ rights, racial equity, mental health advocacy. These are not just political issues for Gen Z. They are deeply personal. They grew up in a world that felt broken in many ways, and they genuinely believe they can fix it, and there's real psychological strength in that belief. What's particularly interesting is that despite their anxiety and the weight of the world on their shoulders, Gen Z consistently shows what psychologists call adaptive resilience. They find new ways to cope. They build communities in unexpected places. They create meaning in a world that often feels meaningless. They are, in the words of researchers, not fragile. They are adapting to conditions that no generation has ever faced before.
So, what do we actually make of all this? Gen Z is a generation that grew up in the most information-saturated, crisis-heavy, socially complex environment in human history. They carry enormous amounts of anxiety, face economic realities that previous generations didn't, and live inside a digital world that's simultaneously connecting and isolating them. They are misunderstood, stereotyped, and dismissed, often by people who forget that they didn't choose the world they were born into. But they are also more emotionally aware, more socially conscious, more open about their struggles, and more determined to build something better than any generation before them. The psychology of Gen Z isn't a story of a broken generation. It's a story of a generation doing the incredibly hard work of figuring out how to be human in a world that's changing faster than any human psychology was ever designed to handle. And honestly, that deserves a lot more respect than it usually gets. If you found this video interesting, drop a comment below. I'd genuinely love to know if you're a Gen Z watching this and whether any of this resonated. Like and subscribe if you want more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one.